The rain came down like God had given up on Texas. It hammered the flat scrubland on both sides of Interstate 40, turned the highway into a black mirror, and beat against the windows of Walt's roadside grill with the kind of patience that made you feel small, the kind of rain that doesn't care about you, the kind that was here before you and will be here long after. Walt Briggs stood behind the counter working a coffee mug with a dish rag that had seen better decades. He was 60 years old, built like a man who had done hard things with his hands for a long time, and he wore that history in his knuckles and in the set of his jaw. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. The grill told the story, the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee that had soaked into the walls so deep you couldn't separate the building from the smell anymore. Walt's roadside grill wasn't a destination. It was a confession. You ended up here when something else went wrong first, when the road ran out of better options, and deposited you at the only light still burning for 30 miles in any direction. Tonight something had gone wrong for a lot of people. The three center booths were full of iron wolves, 12 of them spread out across cracked red vinyl, their leather cuts dark with road damp, their bikes lined up outside in the rain, like a row of iron horses waiting for war. The Iron Wolves MC was not a club you read about in lifestyle magazines. They didn't do charity poker runs for the cameras. They moved product across state lines, and they enforced their own law in a corridor that stretched from Amarillo to Oklahoma City, and they had been doing it long enough that even the serious people gave them room. They were loud tonight, that loose, dangerous loud that comes after the second round and before someone makes a mistake. Donna Fike, the waitress, moved between tables with her eyes down and her shoulders tight. She was 40 years old and had worked this grill for 11 years, and she had learned the way animals learn how to make herself invisible when the room felt like this. Colt Decker was the loudest. He called himself Spur because of the rowel tattoo on his left forearm, though nobody had bothered to ask him why. He was 26 with the kind of confidence that comes from not having been beaten down enough times yet. He was a prospect, not yet a full patch, still earning his way in, and that made him more dangerous in some ways, not less. Prospects have something to prove. They read every room looking for the moment that gets them noticed. Garrett Malone sat 2 seats away from Colt and said almost nothing. He was 45 with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, the kind of scar you get from something fast and metal. His road name was Stitches, and he had earned it twice over. He was the vice president of the chapter, and he carried that weight the way old timber carries weather. You could see it in him, but it wasn't going anywhere. He ate his burger and watched the room and drank his coffee black and kept his own counsel, the way men who have survived long enough in hard places learn to do. The other 10 men fell somewhere between those two poles. Walt refilled the coffee urn and didn't look at the table directly. He had learned that too over years of serving men like these. You developed a kind of peripheral awareness, a way of monitoring, without appearing to monitor, of knowing exactly what was happening in a room without ever letting on that you knew. At 8:17 in the evening, the bell above the door made its small sound. In another kind of night, nobody would have noticed. But the rain was loud enough that the bell cutting through it made every head turn. She came in sideways, fighting the wind for the door, and then it shut behind her and she was inside and the wind was outside, and she stood there for a moment in the fluorescent light dripping. She was 16 years old. She was small in the way that made you think of birds, fine-boned and light, the kind of small that looks fragile until you realize it's just a different kind of structure. Her hair was blonde, plastered flat against her skull by the rain, dark with water, so you couldn't see the color at first. She was shaking. Not dramatically, not the theatrical trembling of someone performing distress, the deep, involuntary shaking of a body that has been cold for a long time and doesn't know how to stop. She had a backpack on. It was a large pack military green, so heavy with water that it seemed to be pulling her backward. It looked like it contained everything she owned. Maybe it did. And she was wearing a jacket. That was the thing. That was what stopped the room. The jacket was leather, old leather, the kind that has been broken in over decades and carries its history in the grain of the hide, grease stains, and road grime. and the specific darkening that comes from 10,000 miles of wind and sun and rain. It was a biker's jacket. There was no question about that. The cut, the weight, the patches. The problem was the size. The jacket was enormous on her. It hung off her narrow shoulders like a tent, like something a child had pulled from a costume box. The sleeves rolled up 5 full times so her hands could poke out from the cuffs. The bottom of it fell below her hips. She was drowning in it. It made her look like a little girl playing dress up, which in most rooms at most times would have been a harmless and maybe even endearing thing to see. This was not most rooms. Colt Decker saw her first, or rather, Colt Decker saw the jacket first, the way a certain kind of man always notices the thing that offends him before he notices the person wearing it. He said something to the man next to him, something low and amused. The man next to him laughed. Then the man next to that man. It spread down the table like a slow-burning fuse, and by the time the girl had made it 3 steps toward the counter, half the table was watching her with that specific attention that is worse than being ignored. Donna had appeared from the kitchen doorway. She looked at the girl, then at the table, and her face did a complicated thing that ended with her forcing a professional smile. "Just one tonight, honey." The girl nodded. Her teeth were chattering. She walked toward this corner booth, the one furthest from the door, and the center tables, the one closest to the restroom hallway. She kept her eyes down. She moved like someone who has learned that the less space you take up, the safer you are. The backpack scraped against the edge of a chair as she passed, and she winced and kept moving. As she passed the center booth, Colt Decker turned fully in his seat. "Hey!" His voice was the kind that fills rooms without trying. "Hey, prospect, you lost." A couple of the men laughed. Someone made a comment about spirit stores and Halloween costumes. The laughter got louder. The girl slid into the corner booth. She did not look up. She pulled the enormous jacket tighter around herself, both arms across her chest, hands gripping the lapels like she was holding the thing closed against a wind only she could feel. Garrett Malone said without looking up from his plate, "Leave it spur." Colt looked at him. "She's wearing cut stitches in our house. She's a kid. That's not the point, and you know it." Garrett ate a French fry. He did not respond immediately. The truth was, he knew Colt wasn't entirely wrong about the protocol. In the world they lived in, leather wasn't fashion. It was language. It said things about who you were and who you answered to and what you had earned. A civilian wearing a cut, especially wearing it like a costume, was by the codes they lived under a form of disrespect. Garrett didn't feel disrespected by a soaking wet teenage girl who looked like she'd walked out of a storm and barely had the strength left to hold herself upright. But he understood that Colt did, and that Colt was the kind of young man who would make a problem out of it, regardless of what Garrett said, because Colt needed this kind of moment more than he needed to be right. Walt set a mug of hot chocolate on the counter without anyone asking. He looked at Donna. She took it to the girl's table without a word. Colt stood up. He was 6'2" and broad-shouldered, and he wore his cut-like armor the way all of them did. He walked to the corner booth the way young men walk when they want to be seen walking with a certain deliberate weight to each step, a performance of authority aimed at the audience behind him as much as at the girl in front of him. He stopped at the table. The girl looked up at him. Her eyes were blue and very tired and rimmed in red, and they held something in them that was not fear exactly, but something that had come out the other side of fear and arrived at a kind of exhausted endurance. She had been afraid for a long time. She was still afraid, but she had made some accommodation with it. "That's a nice jacket," Colt said. She didn't answer. "Where'd you get it?" "It was a gift," she said. Her voice was quiet and steady, steadier than her hands. "From whose spirit, Halloween?" The table behind him made sounds of appreciation. Colt fed on it, turned slightly to acknowledge it, then turned back. "You know what this is?" He gestured at his own cut. "This isn't clothing. You don't just put this on. You earn this. Every patch on here means something. Every color means something. And you," he pointed at the oversized jacket, "are making a joke out of it. So take it off." "I can't," she said. "I'm not asking." "I made a promise." Colt stared at her. A promise to who? She looked down at the table. Her hands tightened on the mug of hot chocolate. My dad. Something shifted in the room, small but real, the way air pressure changes before weather. Garrett felt it. Walt felt it behind the counter. Donna, who had retreated to the kitchen doorway, felt it. It was the kind of shift that happens when a story starts to be more complicated than it looked from the outside. Colt didn't feel it or didn't care. He reached out and grabbed the collar of the jacket. Not rough enough to be assault, not gentle enough to be anything else. He pulled. The girl made a sound sharp and panicked, a short cry of genuine terror, and scrambled back into the corner of the booth. No, please, don't touch it, please. Then take it off yourself. I can't, I promised him, please. Colt pulled again harder, this time impatient now. His grip twisted in the old leather, and something gave, not the leather itself, which was too old and too tough to tear easily, but the lining inside. A long rip of sound cut through the diner, the kind of sound that makes everyone in a room wince at the same moment, a sound of something being damaged that shouldn't be. The girl kicked him. It wasn't a trained kick, wasn't strategic. It was pure animal reflex, her sneaker connecting with his shin with just enough force to surprise him. He stumbled back, not hurt, surprised. The surprise turned his face dark. She kicked me. Garrett was already standing. Spur, that's enough. She kicked a patch member stitches. You grabbed her first. Garrett stepped into the space between them. He was not as tall as Colt, but he was considerably thicker, and the scar on his jaw made his face serious in a way that didn't need words to land. He looked at the girl. Nobody's going to hurt you. You hear me? She was pressed into the corner of the booth, arms wrapped around herself, the jacket pulled tight. She was crying now silently, the tears tracking through the rain still drying on her face. I just need to eat something, she said. I just need to sit somewhere warm. I'm not trying to disrespect anyone. Where'd you come from? Garrett asked. His voice had dropped. Not gentle exactly, Garrett Malone didn't do gentle but low. Serious, the voice of a man who has decided to actually listen. My truck broke down. About a mile back, I walked. In this weather alone. She nodded. The rest of the table had gone quiet. The loose, dangerous energy had shifted into something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or the early stirring of something that would take a little longer to name. Garrett crouched down so he wasn't looming over her, putting himself at eye level, the way you do when you want someone to understand that you mean what you're saying. How old are you? 16. Where are your parents? Something crossed her face then. Something that had already been through the worst of what it was going to feel and had come out damaged, but still moving. That's why I'm here, she said. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the table at Colt, who was still standing with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. Then he looked at Walt, who was watching all of this from behind the counter with the stillness of a man who has made his assessment and is waiting to see if he needs to act on it. Sit down, Spur, Garrett said. Not loud. Just definite, the way a man speaks when he is not going to say it again. Colt sat. Garrett pulled a chair from the nearest empty table and put it at the end of the girl's booth backwards and sat on it with his arms resting on the back. Okay, what's your name? She hesitated. Riley Cross. The name registered nothing in the room. Why would it? She was 16 and small and soaking wet, and her name was Riley Cross. And nothing about that was supposed to mean anything to anyone in this diner on this Tuesday night in November. Okay, Riley Cross, tell me about the jacket. She looked down at it. Her hands moved across the leather with a kind of unconscious tenderness, the way you touch something you've been told to protect and have been protecting for so long that the protection has become its own instinct. It was my dad's, she said. Where's your dad now? The answer came in a voice that had been emptied of everything except the fact of it. Not with drama, not with collapse, just with the flatness of someone who has said a true and terrible thing enough times that the saying of it no longer breaks them open, even though the thing itself still does. He passed 2 days ago. The room was very quiet. His ashes are in my bag. She glanced at the heavy backpack she'd shoved into the corner of the booth. I'm supposed to bring him somewhere. He told me where to go. He told me to wear the jacket. He said if I ever got into trouble, the jacket would explain things better than I could. Garrett looked at the jacket. Not for the first time, but differently now. The thing was genuinely old. He could see that up close in a way he hadn't registered from across the room. The leather had a depth of aging that you couldn't fake, that specific darkness and texture that only comes from decades of real use, real weather, real road. The stitching on the patches was... He stopped. He leaned forward. Something was wrong with what he was seeing. Or rather, something was profoundly right in a way that made no sense, in a way that his brain was trying to process and couldn't quite arrive at yet. It was the feeling of recognizing something before you can name what you're recognizing. The patches. The center patch was not an Iron Wolves patch. He'd registered that immediately, some kind of skeletal design, different configuration than anything current. But the bottom rocker, the curved strip of leather that runs along the bottom of the back panel and tells the world what territory you claim. He couldn't see it clearly from where he was sitting. Stand up for a second, he said. Riley looked at him. I'm not going to take it. I just need to see the back. Please. Something in his tone had changed, and she heard it. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she heard the difference between what his voice had been before and what it was now. She slid out of the booth and stood up, and the jacket settled on her shoulders, enormous and ancient, the back panel straightening out as she stood, and the fluorescent lights of Walt's roadside grill hit the back of Danny Cross's jacket for the first time that night. Garrett Malone stopped breathing. Later, he would not be able to fully describe what happened to him in that moment, because it was not a thing that happened in language. It was a thing that happened somewhere older than language, somewhere in the part of a man that knows certain things, the way a compass knows north, not through reasoning or analysis, but through a kind of fundamental orientation that exists below thought. The center patch, a skeletal hand bones rendered in extraordinary detail, wrapped around an hourglass. The sand in the hourglass was exactly half fallen, frozen at the halfway point, not empty, not full, balanced at the moment between. The bottom rocker, not a state, not a territory, not any of the dozens of place names he'd memorized over 23 years in this life. Two words: nomad first riders. The thread. He was looking at the thread, and the thread was doing something impossible. It was a deep crimson, almost the color of dried blood, and it was thick, thicker than anything used in patchwork in the last 30 years, because the manufacturer who made that specific thread had gone out of business in 1991, and every serious person in this world knew that, because the story of why that manufacturer had gone out of business was its own kind of legend, tied up in a federal raid and a court case that had sent 11 men to prison and ended an era of this life that people still talked about in hushed tones as if discussing something sacred. This thread was from before 1991. Oh my God, someone said from the center table. One of the older men, his voice was barely a sound, barely more than breath shaped into syllables. Colt Decker was on his feet again, but differently now. The belligerence had left him completely replaced by something he didn't have a name for yet, something that looked from the outside like awe and felt from the inside like the ground shifting. Garrett stood up slowly. He was aware in a distant and almost academic way that his hands were not steady. He was 45 years old and had been through things that would end most men's appetites for dinner conversation, and his hands were not steady. Turn around, he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Let me see the front. Riley turned. The front of the jacket left chest panel where a man's road name goes. The place where the thing that defines you in this life is written so that everyone can see it without asking. One word: Iron Jaw. The silence that fell over Walt's roadside grill in that moment was not the silence of people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of people whose minds have just been asked to hold something too large and are struggling with the weight of it. The silence of a room that has just had its understanding of the situation completely inverted. Garrett knew that name. Every serious person in that room over the age of 35 knew that name. Danny Ironjaw Cross, enforcer for the First Riders. The man who had, according to federal court documents, in an equal volume of campfire story, walked into a rival club's Albuquerque headquarters in the winter of 1994 with a sawed-off shotgun and a clear intention and walked out alone. The man who had taken a bullet meant for Marcus Callahan in El Paso in 1998 and gone to federal prison for 10 years with his mouth shut and come out the other side and disappeared into the mythology of the road so completely that most people under 40 thought he was already dead, and most people over 40 weren't sure enough either way to bet on it. I was supposed to have died in prison. That was the story that had circulated. That was what people said when the name came up, which was less and less often as the years passed. The first riders were gone. They had been dismantled in the federal raids of 2001, their membership scattered, their leadership broken and imprisoned, and in some cases simply gone. They existed now only as a kind of scripture, the foundational text of half the clubs operating in the Southern Corridor. The thing everyone pointed to when they talked about what this life used to mean before it got complicated, before the margins got thin and the compromises started. And here was a 16-year-old girl standing in a roadside diner outside Amarillo, Texas, drowning in Ironjaw's jacket, carrying his ashes in a waterlogged backpack. Garrett moved before he fully understood what he was doing. There was no decision involved. His knees hit the linoleum. 250 pounds of scarred, weathered vice president of the Iron Wolves MC, kneeling on the dirty floor of a diner, so he was eye level with a girl less than half his age, because there are moments in a man's life that require a man to kneel, whether he wants to or not. Moments where the only appropriate posture is one that acknowledges something larger than yourself. The rest of the table was on its feet. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was making comments about costume stores. Colt Decker was standing with his mouth slightly open, the swagger gone out of him, completely replaced by something raw and unfinished. The expression of a young man who has just understood that the world contains more weight than he'd previously accounted for. Walt Briggs behind the counter had set down his dish rag. His hand had moved without hurry and without drama to a position just below the counter's edge. "Riley," Garrett said. He kept his voice low the way you keep your voice low in certain churches or at certain graves. "Riley Cross, your father is Danny Cross." She looked at him from above. Something was happening in her expression. A wariness, the wariness of someone who has been showing their vulnerability in a room full of strangers and is now watching those strangers rearrange themselves around new information, not sure yet whether the rearrangement is good or dangerous. "Yes," she said. "You said he passed 2 days ago." "Yes. And he told you to come here, to find someone." She reached into the pocket of the jacket, the small interior pocket, the one sewn into the left breast panel, the one a man uses for things he needs to reach quickly and without looking, and she produced a piece of paper. It was folded 4 times and soft at the folds from being handled many times over many days. She unfolded it and held it out. Garrett took it, read it. The handwriting was deteriorated, the handwriting of a man whose hands had given him trouble at the end, the letters carefully formed but effortful, but it was legible. Clear enough. "Find Marcus Callahan. Tell him Ironjaw is calling in the soul he owes. Tell him to keep my girl safe. The jacket will say the rest. Marcus Callahan, Stone, president of the Iron Wolves MC." The man Danny Cross had taken a bullet for in El Paso in 1998. The man who had built the Iron Wolves partly on the foundation of a debt that had never in 25 years been formally acknowledged or formally repaid, because the man it was owed to had never once asked for it. Garrett looked up at Riley. "Did your father tell you who Marcus Callahan is?" "He said he's the man who owes him a life," Riley said. "He said Marcus would know what to do. He said Marcus would remember." Garrett folded the paper carefully and held it back out to her. She took it and returned it to the pocket. He stood up slowly, his knees protesting the way they always did now, and turned to face his men. 12 faces ranging from stunned to reverent, to in Colt Decker's case visibly and completely ashamed of everything that had happened in the last 20 minutes. "Sit down," Garrett said to all of them. "Every one of you, Right now. They sat. Donna had reappeared from somewhere and was standing near the kitchen door with a fresh pot of coffee, holding it in both hands, apparently having forgotten entirely what she'd brought it out to do. Garrett turned back to Riley. Sit down, please. Can Donna get you something to eat? Riley slid back into the corner booth. She was still shaking, but the quality of the trembling had changed in a way that was hard to describe, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. It was still cold and exhaustion. But there was something else in it now, the trembling of a person who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time and has just for the first time set it down somewhere that might be able to hold some of the weight. I haven't eaten since yesterday, she said. Garrett nodded at Donna. Donna moved. He pulled his chair back to the end of the booth and sat down again. The diner was quiet enough now that he could hear the rain on the windows and the hiss of the grill and the low, steady sound of Riley's breathing. Your mother, he said. Where is she? Riley looked at the table. She turned the mug of hot chocolate in her hands, slow rotations around and around the way. Hands need to be doing something when the rest of you is very still. She was killed, she said, 8 months ago, at our house in Flagstaff. The word killed landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The police said it was a robbery gone wrong, Riley continued. Her voice had the flat, worn quality of someone reciting facts. They have recited many times facts that have been processed and reprocessed until the rawness has been worn down to something smoother and harder, like Riverstone. My dad didn't believe that. He said it wasn't random. He said someone came to our house looking for him. She paused. He said whoever killed my mom knew where we lived because someone told them. Garrett was very still. Someone who knew your father. Someone who knew where we lived and knew our schedule and knew that my dad was sick and what that meant for how ready he'd be. She looked up. My dad said that's not a stranger. That's someone close. The room absorbed that. I was already sick by then, Riley said. His lungs. He'd been sick for a while, but after my mom died, he got worse faster. He said it was like his body decided to stop arguing. She said this without apparent bitterness, just as a thing that was true, one fact among many facts that she had organized into a comprehensible shape. He spent the last 8 months trying to find out who it was. He didn't tell me everything. He said the less I knew, the safer I was. But he kept writing things down, in a notebook, every night at the table with his coffee going cold beside him. She paused. 2 nights ago, he told me it was time. He gave me the jacket. He gave me the note. He told me about Marcus Callahan. He told me to take his bike, it's on a trailer on the truck, about a mile back on the highway, and bring his ashes to the people he used to ride with. He said to find the Iron Wolves. He said Marcus would be there or someone who could reach him. He called us wolves, one of the men said from the table. He wasn't being confrontational. He was genuinely asking. He called the clubs that came after the riders the young wolves, Riley said. The ones who kept going when the riders were gone. He said you built on what they left. She said it without judgment, just reporting what her father had told her. Several of the older men exchanged looks that carried entire conversations in them. Riley, Garrett said slowly, your father gave you specific instructions. Come here, find us, give us the note. Did he say anything else? Anything else you need to tell us before I make a call? She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the mug in her hands. She looked around the diner at the faces of the 12 men who 20 minutes ago had been jeering at her and were now watching her with an attention so focused it was almost palpable, like pressure. She set the mug down. He said to be careful, she said, with the wolves. Garrett frowned. Careful how? Riley looked at him steadily with those tired, red-rimmed blue eyes that had seen too much in 8 months and learned somewhere in the seeing how to look back at hard things without flinching. He said the people who killed my mom weren't strangers to this life. He said someone gave them information, a home address, a daily schedule, knowledge of how sick he was and what that meant. She paused, and the pause had weight to it. Cartel doesn't know where a man lives who's been off the road for 15 years unless someone tells him. Someone who knew Danny Cross. Someone who knew where he'd landed. She stopped. Garrett waited. Dad said the people who killed my mom are wearing your patches. The silence that followed was of a different quality than any that had come before it in that room. It was not the silence of shock. It was not the silence of awe. It was the silence of a room full of men who have just been told that one of them is something other than what he appears to be. And every single one of them is now looking at the others and doing the math, and nobody likes where the math is pointing. 12 men, 11 innocent by any honest accounting. One of them, something else entirely, something that had been wearing the same patches, eating at the same tables, riding the same roads, and carrying a secret that had just run out of places to hide. Nobody spoke. Outside, the rain came down without ceasing, patient and indifferent the way it had been coming down before any of them were born, and would continue long after all of them were gone. Walt Briggs reached below the counter. He came up with a sawed-off shotgun, short and purposeful, and he set it on the shelf beneath the register where he could reach it without moving more than 8 inches in any direction. He did this without announcement, without drama, the way a man does something he has been thinking about doing for the last several minutes and has finally concluded is correct. Donna retreated to the kitchen and did not come back out. Garrett Malone reached into his cut and found his phone. His thumb hovered over Marcus Callahan's number. He looked at Riley, who was looking back at him with the steady, stripped-down gaze of a person who has already lost the thing she was most afraid of losing and has arrived somewhere beyond ordinary fear, not fearless, but past the point where fear can stop her from doing what needs to be done. He pressed call. The phone rang twice. Then Marcus Callahan's voice, low and rough as gravel, pulled from a riverbed. What? Press, Garrett said. You need to come to Walt's, right now. I'm at the warehouse. What's the problem? Garrett looked at the girl in the corner booth. He looked at the jacket, at the patches that had turned a room full of hard men into something quieter and more serious than they'd been 10 minutes ago. He looked at the 12 men sitting in silence, one of them wearing his brotherhood as a disguise. The problem, Garrett said, is that Iron Jaw's daughter just walked through the door, and she says one of our brothers killed her mother. The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 4 seconds. Lock the door, Marcus said. Nobody leaves. I'm 20 minutes out. The call ended. Garrett lowered the phone. He looked at the assembled men of the Iron Wolves chapter, his brothers, the men he rode with, the men he would have said this morning without hesitation that he trusted completely. He looked at them differently now. He couldn't help it. The knowing changed the looking even when you didn't know which one it was. He reached over and turned the lock on the front door. The deadbolt slid home with a sound like a sentence ending. Then he walked to the window and pulled the blinds. The rain continued. The grill hissed quietly to itself. Somewhere in the kitchen a timer went off and nobody answered it. Riley Cross sat in her corner booth with her father's jacket wrapped around her and her father's ashes in her bag and the last instructions of a dying man folded in her pocket, and she waited. The way she had been waiting for 8 months. For someone to come who could hold some of this with her. And somewhere in that room among men who called each other brothers and would have said they meant it, someone waited too, with a different kind of patience and a different kind of fear and a secret that had just run out of room. The 20 minutes felt like a year. Nobody talked. That was the thing that pressed hardest on the room, not the locked door, not the rain, not the knowledge that someone in those center booths had given a home address and a schedule to people who used that information to kill a woman in her own kitchen. It was the silence. 12 men who had ridden together, eaten together, bled for each other in some cases, and now they sat looking at their coffee cups and their half-eaten food, and anywhere except directly at each other, because looking meant asking, and nobody wanted to be the one to ask. Garrett stood near the door with his arms crossed and his back to the wall. He had positioned himself to see the front entrance, the kitchen door, and all 3 center booths simultaneously. 23 years in this life had taught him certain geometries of rooms and where to stand in them. Colt Decker sat with his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. He was 26 years old, and for the first time in this room, he looked at not the performed authority of a prospect trying to become something, but the unfinished face of a young man who has just understood that the world is heavier than he thought, and that he has been adding to that weight in ways he is only now beginning to account for. He had been the one to grab the jacket. He had been the one to tear the lining. Whatever came next in this room, he would carry that. Riley had not moved from the corner booth. Donna had come out of the kitchen once briefly and set a plate in front of the girl, eggs and toast and bacon, the plain fuel of people in difficult circumstances, and Riley had eaten it with a focused mechanical efficiency that made clear she had not been lying about not eating since yesterday. She ate without looking up, without speaking, with no apparent awareness of the 12 men watching her from across the room. When she finished, she folded her hands around the mug and looked at the rain against the window and waited with the patience of someone who has been waiting a long time already and knows how to do it. Walt had not moved from behind the counter. The shotgun remained on the shelf within reach, a fact that everyone in the room carried in their peripheral awareness, whether or not they were looking at it. At the 31-minute mark, 11 minutes past the estimate, which told Garrett that Marcus had driven faster than he'd said, the sound arrived. It came before the lights did felt in the chest, before it registered as anything identifiable. A low, deep resonance, the vibration of multiple large engines running in formation, disciplined and synchronized. Then the headlights swept across the front windows in pairs, 5, then 10, then 15, turning the rain-streaked glass into a wall of white fire that bleached the diner interior for a long moment. The engines filled the world and then cut simultaneously, everyone at once, the coordinated silence dropping harder than the sound had. Nobody in the Iron Wolves chapter spoke. Nobody moved. The door handle moved, found the lock. Garrett crossed the room and turned the deadbolt and stepped back. The door opened and Marcus Callahan came through it. I was 62 years old. He wore a black duster coat over his cut, soaked through from the rain, though. The rain seemed to be something that happened to the world around him rather than to him directly. His beard was white and long, braided loosely, and his face was the face of a man who has been through the refining fire of consequence for 4 decades and emerged not broken but compressed. Everything unnecessary burned away, what remained dense and intentional and serious in a way that changed the air around him. He did not look at Garrett. He did not look at his assembled men. He scanned the room with a single, slow, professional sweep, the scan of a man who has spent his entire adult life reading rooms for the things that could kill him. And then his eyes found the corner booth and he walked toward it. His boots on the linoleum were the only sound. Behind him, through the open door before Garrett closed it again, 6 men had followed him in. These were his nomads, his personal guardmen who wore no state rocker because they answered to no chapter and no territory except his. They took up positions near the door in the kitchen entrance without being directed, with the quiet efficiency of people who have done this many times and know how it works. Marcus stopped at the corner booth. He stood and looked at Riley for a moment. She looked back at him without shrinking. She had been through too much in the last 8 months to be unmade by another large man looking at her seriously. Then Marcus Callahan looked at the jacket. He looked at the center patch, the skeletal hand, the hourglass, the sand frozen at the halfway point. His face changed very slightly, the way bedrock changes when water finds a crack in it. From the outside, you almost can't see it, but something real is giving way beneath the surface. He looked at the bottom rocker. He read the 2 words. He was still for a long moment. Then he reached out his right hand, the hand missing its ring finger, lost to something 20 years ago that people told different versions of, and he placed it flat against the back of the jacket, palm on the leather, with a gentleness so particular and deliberate that it silenced every remaining sound in the room. His eyes closed. When they opened, there was something in them that the men of the Iron Wolves had never seen there before in all the years they had ridden for him. It was not weakness. It was something that lives below the categories of strength and weakness, both in the part of a man that remembers who he was before he became what the world made of him. He said very quietly, "Danny, you stubborn son of a bitch. You finally came home." He stayed like that for a moment, his hand on the leather, his eyes holding something private. Then he straightened. His hand came off the jacket. Whatever had been in his eyes moved behind something harder and colder and more purposeful. He turned to face the room. to face his men. The temperature dropped, not as a figure of speech. The air in Walt's roadside grill became genuinely colder in the 30 seconds that followed, as if Marcus Callahan's grief had been converted directly and efficiently into something that could be used. Someone in this room, Marcus said, his voice level and quiet and complete, killed Danny Cross's wife. He did not phrase it as a question. We are going to find out who, and nobody is leaving this building until we do. He looked at Garrett. Tell me what she said. Garrett told him. The jacket, the note, the ashes, the truck on the side of the highway with the bike on its trailer. Carol Cross killed 8 months ago in Flagstaff. Danny's certainty that it wasn't random, wasn't a robbery, was targeted and informed. His belief that whoever provided the information ran with a club. He told it plainly and completely, the way Garrett Malone told things, without decoration, without emphasis, beyond what the facts themselves carried laid out in sequence. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Garrett finished, Marcus turned back to Riley. Your father's note said he was calling in a debt, Marcus said. Yes. Did he tell you what the debt was? He said you owe him a life, Riley said. He said you'd know what that meant. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I know what it means. He pulled a chair from the nearest table and set it at the end of her booth. He sat down. Your father saved my life in El Paso in 1998. Took a bullet that was meant for me. Spent 10 years in a federal prison for it. He had opportunities to make a deal to give names to be out in 2 years instead of 10. He didn't take any of them. A pause that had weight in it. That's the debt. Riley nodded slowly. She had known some version of this. He never called it in, Marcus said. 25 years. He never once picked up the phone and said, Marcus, I need something from you. Not once in all that time. He was saving it, Riley said, simply as if this were obvious. Marcus looked at her. A long look, the kind that takes inventory. Yes, he said. He was. He reached into his duster and found a knife. A short, heavy-bladed tool, the kind that has been used for so many practical purposes over so many years that it has lost any specific menace and become simply an extension of a man's hand. He held it toward the jacket. There's something in the lining, he said. I can feel it. I need your permission. Riley looked at the knife, looked at him, nodded. Marcus turned her gently by the shoulder and ran his thumb along the lower back panel of the jacket, pressing carefully, methodically, until he found what he was looking for. A stiffness that wasn't leather or standard padding, a shape that had no business being there. He worked the knife into the interior seam with surgical care, one thread two, and reached in with 2 fingers and withdrew a small flat object wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and secured with black electrical tape. A notebook, small black sewn binding heavy covers. The plastic wrapping had kept it dry through everything. He set it on the table between them and looked at it without opening it. What did he tell you about it? Marcus asked. He said it was his work, Riley said. He said it was everything. He said if anything happened to him before he could get it to the right people, I needed to make sure it got to Marcus Callahan and nobody else. He was very specific about that. Marcus opened it. The room was so quiet that the sound of pages turning was audible. What Danny Ironjaw Cross had compiled in that small black notebook over 8 months of dying was methodical and devastating, impatient in a way that made you understand something about the man who had built it. Dates, GPS coordinates documented over weeks of observation, license plate numbers, bank routing numbers, and account information with balances. Names, not road names, not the aliases people use in this life, but legal names, the names on driver's licenses and property deeds and federal employment records and pay stubs. The names of Sinaloa cartel logistics men operating in the Southwest Corridor. The names of 3 county sheriffs, including one Lyle Craddock, and the specific amounts and dates of payments made to them. The names of 2 federal contractors whose agency affiliations made their presence in this documentation particularly explosive. And woven through all of it, a pattern of movement shipment routes, timing windows, hand-off locations documented with the patience of a man who knew he was running out of time and had decided to use every hour he had left on something that would outlast him. Marcus turned pages. He said nothing. Garrett looked over his shoulder and said nothing. The men at the center tables could not see the pages, but they could read Marcus's face. In what they saw, there was something they had not seen there before. He built a case, Marcus said quietly to no one in particular. By himself, dying. He built an entire federal case, the kind that takes a task force years, and he did it alone in 8 months with bad lungs and a dead wife and a daughter to protect. He said knowing things was the only real currency, Riley said. He said information never loses value if you collect it right. Marcus closed the notebook. He held it in both hands for a moment, weighing it, thinking about what it contained and what it meant. Then he looked up at the assembled chapter. Your father was right, he said to Riley, though his eyes moved across the men as he spoke. Whoever killed your mother had specific intelligence. A home address in Flagstaff. A daily routine. Knowledge that Danny was sick and what that meant for how ready he'd be for company. That kind of information doesn't come from the cartel. He set the notebook down. Cartel doesn't do that homework on a man who's been off the road for 15 years. They needed a source, someone who knew Danny, someone who knew where he'd settled. He let that sit in the room and do its work. Riley, his voice shifted slightly. You said you took something from the man who came to your house the night your mother was killed. Riley reached into the inner pocket of the jacket, past the folded note, and produced something else. She set it on the table. A Zippo lighter. Brushed chrome, well used, the surface worn to a soft mat from years of handling. On the side, engraved in clean, deep lines, a wolf's head and profile ears laid back with a dagger running through it vertically. Below the image, a date engraved in the same precise hand. March 14th, 2021. Marcus picked it up. He turned it over. He looked at the engraving carefully, the way a man looks at something he recognizes and needs to confirm before he speaks. This was on your kitchen floor, he said. Near where my mom was found, Riley said. I picked it up before the police arrived. My dad told me to keep it. He said it was evidence, but not the kind you give to the police, not yet. Marcus held the lighter up so the room could see it clearly. We have these made, he said. His voice had gone quiet in a way that was different from quiet before this, was the quiet of a man choosing his words with great care, because what he says next is going to change things permanently. 5 years of service. Custom order, same engraver for 15 years. Wolf and dagger. I have the records of every one of these ever ordered. He paused. 14 have been made. In the entire history of this chapter, I know where every one of them is supposed to be. He set the lighter on the table. Empty your pockets, Marcus said. Everyone, everything on the table, right now. For a beat, nobody moved, not from refusal, but from the sheer weight of the command. The body needing a moment to catch up to something the mind has already understood. Then they moved, all of them. Phones, wallets, tools, lighters, keys, everything came out onto the tables. The sound of it was a kind of percussion, metal and leather on wood, the involuntary music of men being accounted for. Marcus walked the length of the tables. He looked at everything. He cataloged it the way he cataloged rooms, completely without wasted attention, in a single slow pass. He stopped. At the far end of the center booth, near the jukebox that nobody had fed money into all night, a man named Dredge Harmon had placed his phone on the table. His wallet, a folding knife, a book of matches, no lighter. Dredge Axel Harmon was 48 years old, built like something load-bearing, with a shaved head and a geometric tattoo covering the right side of his neck. He was the sergeant-at-arms of the chapter, the man responsible for security, for vetting, for ensuring that the people inside the circle were who and what they claimed to be. He had held that position for 6 years. He was trusted in the way that only deep institutional trust works, the trust of a man who has passed through enough checkpoints over enough years that the checking itself has quietly stopped. I was looking at the table in front of him, not at Marcus. Axel, Marcus said. Harmon looked up. Where's your lighter? A pause, brief but there. Don't smoke anymore, Garrett said from across the room without inflection. I watched you smoke outside an hour before we came in here. Harmon's jaw moved. a small, almost invisible adjustment. Trying to quit. Show me your pockets, Marcus said. All of them. Harmon looked at him, and in that look, something passed between them, the weight of a secret that has been maintained under sustained pressure for a long time, and the specific exhaustion of a man who has finally run out of the will to keep maintaining it. He didn't reach for his pockets. He smiled instead. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man releasing something not with relief, not with regret, but with a grim and final kind of liberation. The long breath of a man who has been holding something too heavy for too long and has simply decided to put it down. You want to know what's in my pockets, Marcus? His voice was steady, steadier than anything in the room had a right to be. Or do you want to know what I put under the floor of this building 2 hours ago while all of you were watching the girl? The room fractured, not with noise, not with shouting or sudden movement. It fractured the way ice fractures when the temperature finally drops past the threshold, a crack that starts at one point and runs outward in every direction in the same instant. And what was one solid thing is suddenly and irreversibly something else. Marcus did not reach for his weapon. He went very still instead, in the way of a man who has learned over 40 years that stillness properly deployed is more dangerous than motion. Say that again, Marcus said. C4. Harmon said it the way you say something obvious, a thing that doesn't require emphasis, because the emphasis is already in the fact of it. 3 charges, under the floorboards between the joists. I found the access panels in the crawl space this afternoon. He reached into his vest, deliberately showing what his hand was doing and what it was reaching for, and produced a small black cylinder 4 inches long with a rubber cap trigger at one end. Remote detonator, single trigger. I have been planning for a night like this for almost 2 years. I didn't know it would be this specific night or this specific reason, but I knew something would eventually pull you out of the warehouse. And here we are. He glanced at Riley briefly. Didn't plan for the girl. The nomads near the door had their hands on their weapons. Garrett had his gun out held low. 3 other men from the chapter had drawn, all of them pointing in the same direction, and none of them firing because Harmon's thumb was resting against the rubber cap of the detonator, and everyone in the room understood what C4 does to a wood frame building at close range. Back off, Harmon said, the voice of a man who has thought this through many times and is following a plan. Everyone, hands visible. Anyone moves fast, my thumb slips. You know the physics. Nobody moved. The cartel pays by confirmed result, Harmon said. I don't collect if I'm dead, so here's what happens. I walk out of here. I take the truck out front, the girl's truck, and the bike on the trailer. I drive. If nobody follows me for 6 hours, I call in the charge locations, and you can have your building back. He began moving toward the kitchen door, backwards slowly, keeping the room in front of him. The bike alone is worth $250,000 to the right collector. The cartel will pay double that for it as a symbol. The notebook is a bonus. Marcus Callahan had not moved, had not spoken. He was standing in the center of the room, watching Dredge Harmon back toward the kitchen door with an expression that existed somewhere beyond anger. Anger is hot. What was on Marcus's face was cold and total and permanent, the expression of a man making an entry in a ledger that does not have an eraser. You killed Carol Cross, Marcus said. Harmon paused at this. Not from guilt. The pause was something else, more like a man who has been asked to confirm a fact he considers secondary to the current situation. I went to the house for Danny. She was there first. She made noise. A flat pause. I didn't know there was a daughter. If I'd known, I'd have handled it differently. That's supposed to make it better. It's supposed to make it accurate. Harmon had reached the kitchen door. His hand found it. This is business, Marcus. You've been running this club on honor codes written for a world that's been gone for 30 years. The first riders are history. The margins are gone. The cartel offered me something real. I took it. He pushed the door open an inch. Don't follow me. He was watching Marcus. He was watching Garrett. He was tracking the nomads near the front door. I was not watching Riley Cross. She had been sitting in that corner booth through all of it. through the revelation and the drawn guns and the detonator, and Harmon's calm, business-like accounting of what he had done and why he had done it. She had sat with her hands around a mug that had gone cold and her father's jacket on her shoulders, and she had listened to a man explain in a tone of complete professional detachment that he had killed her mother because her mother had been present when he came to kill her father, and that the only reason Riley herself was still alive was that he hadn't known she existed. She had listened to every word of this, and then she stood up. "Sit down." Harmon's voice fractured for the first time, the first crack in the composure. "Girl, sit down right now." She stepped out from behind the booth and walked toward him. "I will blow this building," Harmon said. His thumb pressed the rubber cap. "No, you won't," Riley said. She walked across the linoleum of Walt's roadside grill toward a man holding a bomb trigger, a 16-year-old girl in a dead man's jacket, walking steadily and without performance. "Riley!" Garrett's voice sharp and urgent. "Stop!" She didn't stop. "You followed me here," she said to Harmon. Her voice was doing something that cut through everything else in the room. It was not loud. It was not performed bravery. It was simply clear, the way things get clear when every layer of fear and strategy and pretense has been stripped away, and what's left is just the thing itself. "You've been following me for weeks, since Flagstaff. You knew where my dad was because you've been tracking me, waiting for me to lead you to him." Harmon's eyes narrowed. "You didn't come tonight because of a trap," she said. "You came because you needed to find the notebook. Dad never kept it at the house. You searched the house after you killed my mom, and it wasn't there. So you needed me to lead you to it." She was 6 feet from him now. "You need that notebook, and you need me alive to find out if there are other copies, which means you cannot blow this building with me in it." Something moved behind Harmon's eyes. Rapid calculation. She was right, and he knew she was right, and the knowledge of it showed just briefly before he could put something else back over it. "You think that works on me," he said. "I think you're a practical man," Riley said. "Dead men don't collect. That's what my dad always said about men like you. You always think there's still a deal to be made on the other side." 4 feet. "Stop walking," he said. She stopped. She looked at him for a moment with those blue eyes that were tired and red-rimmed and completely steady. Then she reached into the pocket of the jacket. Harmon's two nearest men started to move. Riley's hand came out holding a single key on a plain ring, the kind of key that belongs to old machinery, heavy and undecorated, the key to something that has been running for 40 years because it was built right. The ignition key to a 1978 Harley-Davidson shovelhead. Harmon's eyes went to it before he could stop them. That bike was worth more to certain buyers than anything else in the building combined. The personal machine of Danny Ironjaw Cross, restored and running with provenance that collectors and the cartel alike would pay extraordinary money to own. "You want it," Riley said. He looked at the key, at her face, at the key. She threw it straight up hard toward the slowly turning ceiling fan above the center of the room. The key caught a blade, deflected with a sharp metallic sound, arced sideways across the room, and Harmon's eyes tracked it, the involuntary movement of a greedy man who cannot make himself not look. And in that fraction of a second when his attention left the room and followed the spinning silver shape through the air, Walt Briggs rose from behind the counter. The sound of the shotgun in the enclosed space was not something you heard so much as something that happened to you physically, that rearranged the air in your chest and replaced the world with a high ringing that would last for minutes. Dredge Harmon went backward through the kitchen door. The detonator left his hand. Garrett Malone was already moving, had been moving from the instant. Riley's key left her fingers, something in him, reading the geometry of the moment before it resolved, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and went down on the linoleum and covered the detonator with his body, pulling it underneath him, 250 pounds of everything he was between the device and any possibility of it being triggered by anything or anyone. Silence. The ringing. Then other sounds returning gradually, like the world remembering itself. Rain on the windows. The ceiling fan still turning. Someone's unsteady breathing. The kitchen door swinging slowly on its hinges. Garrett rolled over carefully. He looked at the detonator in his hands. His thumb found the safety beneath the rubber cap and pressed it home and held it there firm and permanent. His hands were shaking now. That was all right. Shaking after was allowed. It meant you had gotten through the other side. Is there actually C4 under the floor? One of the men asked. His voice came from some distance, still filtered through the ringing. Don't know, Garrett said. Don't jump. Was he telling the truth about the charges? Marcus asked Walt. Walt racked the shotgun and ejected the spent shell. It rolled across the linoleum and came to rest against a chair leg. He looked at Marcus with the calm expression of a man who has done something he was prepared to do and finds it sits with him the way it's supposed to sit. I'll pull the panels in the morning, he said. Tonight I need someone to fix my kitchen door. Marcus looked at the door, at Walt. Then he turned to the room. Riley Cross was standing in the center of the linoleum. The jacket hung from her narrow shoulders. Her chest was rising and falling with a breathing that was slightly too fast and slightly too shallow. The body running on the last of its adrenaline, beginning to understand that the immediate thing had passed. She was looking at the kitchen door. Marcus walked to her. He stopped and looked at her face for a long moment, the way you look at someone when you're taking a real accounting. You knew he wouldn't press it, Marcus said. I thought he wouldn't, she said carefully. There was a real difference between those two things, and she was precise about it. Dad always said the greedy ones never want to die. They always believe there's one more deal available. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Your father said that. He said a lot of things. A pause. I should have written them down. Something shifted in Marcus Callahan's face. Not dramatically. A deepening around the eyes, the expression of a man feeling something that his existing categories don't quite fit. He reached into his duster and withdrew the notebook. He held it in both hands. He looked around the room at his nomads, at the chapter men, at Garrett sitting on the floor with the detonator, at Walt behind the counter, at the kitchen door still moving. This book, Marcus said, is the most dangerous thing in this state right now. It has names in it that will end careers and dismantle arrangements that have been profitable for 20 years. If the wrong people know we have it, they will send more than one man with a bomb. He looked at Riley. Your father left this to you. It's your property, your call. Riley looked at the notebook. She thought about her father at the kitchen table every night for 8 months, his coffee going cold beside him, writing in careful, deteriorating handwriting, building something he knew he would not live to see used. She thought about her mother, who had not been part of this world, who had simply loved a complicated man and built a life beside him and been killed for the association. She thought about Garrett on his knees on the linoleum. She thought about the way Walt had come up from behind that counter. She looked at Marcus Callahan. My dad didn't quit, she said. Her voice was steady in a way that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with what she had decided. He was dying and he didn't quit. He spent 8 months building this knowing he'd never see what it started. She held the notebook out. Don't quit. Marcus took it. He held it for a moment. Then he closed his fist around it and looked at his men, the ones who had not broken their oaths, the ones who had sat in this room tonight and had the ground move under them and had held. Call the chapters, he said to Garrett. Call the support clubs. Tell them we ride at dawn. A pause. We have a funeral to plan, and after the funeral we have other business. He turned back to Riley. She was swaying, subtly a slight rhythmic instability, the body announcing that it has reached the absolute end of what it can sustain through will alone. 8 months of adrenaline compressing into one November night, and now draining out all at once, leaving behind the exhaustion that had been living underneath it the entire time. Garrett was on his feet. He had seen it coming, had been watching her the way you watch something valuable that is close to falling, and he crossed the room in time. When Riley's eyes lost focus and her knees unlocked, he was there, and he caught her before the floor did. She was light in his arms, impossibly so, a small girl in a dead man's jacket, and he held her the way you hold something irreplaceable. I've got her, he said. Marcus was already at the door, already on his phone, already organizing the next thing. But he paused at the threshold and looked back at the girl in Garrett's arms. Bring her, he said. We're going to the compound. He looked at Walt. Send me the bill for the door. Walt was already reaching for the phone. He had people to call. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. The engines of the Nomad bikes were running their exhausts, sending white breath into the wet air. And through the open door came the smell of rain and gasoline and cold Texas night, and the road that was out there in the dark, waiting for morning. Garrett carried Riley Cross out of the corner booth where she had arrived alone and terrified and smaller than seemed possible for someone carrying what she carried. He walked her through the door into the night, and the jacket moved with her, the old leather holding its shape. The way good leather does, the patches clear in the rain-washed air. The key to the shovel head was somewhere on the diner floor. Someone would find it. They always found the things that mattered. She didn't dream. The sleep that took her was not the sleep of peace. It was the sleep of a body that has been running on borrowed energy for so long that when the debt finally comes due, it comes due all at once without negotiation or grace period. She fell into it the way a stone falls into deep water, fast, and then slower, and then completely still. When she opened her eyes, the world was pine and light. The ceiling above her was tongue and groove boards, amber-colored and warm in the morning light that came through a single east-facing window. The bed was real, not a motel bed, not a truck seat, not a floor with clean sheets and a wool blanket the color of charcoal. The room was small and simply furnished. A wooden chair in the corner held folded clothes that weren't hers. A braided rug covered the floor between the bed and the window. On the windowsill, someone had placed a glass of water. She sat up. The panic came first, the way it always did. Now that automatic spike of fear that had been her morning companion since Flagstaff, the half-second of not knowing where she was or what had happened or whether the worst thing was still coming. Then her eyes found the window, the light, the glass of water on the sill, and the panic receded into something she could manage. She was at the Iron Wolves compound. She remembered Garrett carrying her. She remembered the smell of exhaust and rain. After that, nothing until now. Through a half-open door came the slow rhythm of a rocking chair and the soft occasional click of knitting needles. You're awake, a woman's voice, settled and unhurried. Riley pushed the blanket back. She was wearing a t-shirt that wasn't hers, large and dark green with a faded Rally logo from 12 years ago. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and looked at the doorway. The woman in the rocking chair was in her mid-50s, gray-streaked dark hair pulled back simply. A face that had lived in it, not hardened, but settled, the face of someone who has made her peace with a life that asked a great deal of her and had mostly delivered on what it promised in return. She was knitting something small in cream-colored yarn. I'm Lorraine, she said, Garrett's wife. You're at the compound. You've been asleep for 14 hours. 14 hours. Riley looked at the window, morning light clear and thin. She had walked into Walt's roadside grill at 8:15 on a Tuesday night. It was Wednesday morning now, 9 o'clock. My dad's ashes, she said immediately. Safe, your bag is there. Lorraine nodded toward the corner of the room where Riley's waterlogged backpack sat against the wall. The jacket is in the chapel. Marcus is with it. Riley stood. Her legs were unsteady for a moment, the legs of someone who has burned through more cortisol in one night than most people process in a year. She steadied herself on the bedpost. Come eat, Lorraine said, setting her knitting aside. Everything else will still be there. The hallway outside the room ran the full length of the upper floor, its walls lined with photographs in plain frames. Black and white prints, some of them old enough that the film grain was visible, the image quality of a different era. Men on motorcycles, the heavy chrome-laden machines of the 60s and 70s, the riders in denim and leather squinting into sun that fell differently then. Groups of men at gas stations and roadhouses. Men on the shoulders of highways that had fewer lanes now than they did when these photographs were taken. Riley slowed at one near the middle of the hall. Two men, young mid-20s at most, standing beside a long, low shovelhead outside a building whose sign was partially out of frame. They had their arms around each other's shoulders, and they were laughing at something outside the camera's view. The full, uninhibited laugh of men who are not yet old enough to know that some things end. One of them was dark-haired with a jaw that went on forever, and eyes that even in the faded photograph had a quality of watchfulness that didn't interfere with the laughter but was always present in it. The other one was her father. She stood there. She had not seen a photograph of her father young in a very long time. He hadn't kept many. She had known in the abstract way children know things about their parents' lives before they existed, that her father had been a different kind of man in a different kind of world. The photograph made it specific in a way the abstract never had. He had been 20-something once. He had laughed like that once without the weight of everything that came after. That was 1989, Lorraine said from beside her. The summer before the raids. Marcus says it was the last good summer before everything changed. Riley looked at it for another moment. Then she continued down the hall. The main room of the compound was built for gathering a long bar along one wall. Pool tables, leather couches arranged around a stone fireplace, a mounted skull above the mantel that someone had sprayed silver once and never corrected. The room smelled of coffee and old wood and the accumulated presence of many men over many years, a smell that was not unpleasant but was unmistakably what it was. It was full. Men in cuts she didn't recognize stood in groups alongside iron wolves. Two men near the bar wore patches she would later learn belonged to the Grim Riders. Three men across the room wore Iron Horseman Nevada. They had come during the night. Word had moved through whatever network these people used, and they had come. When Riley appeared at the foot of the stairs, the room went quiet. Not the aggressive quiet of the diner. Not the quiet of men calculating. This was a different silence, slower and more deliberate. The silence of a room full of people choosing collectively and without coordination to acknowledge something. Men who had been mid-sentence stopped. Men who had been looking elsewhere turned. Someone near the bar stood up, and then someone near the window, and then it moved through the room like a current. And by the time Riley had taken 3 steps onto the main floor, every person in the room was standing. She was 16 years old, and she had spent 8 months being invisible as a survival strategy, and she had no available response to this except to keep walking. Marcus was at the head of a long mahogany table at the far end of the room. Garrett stood to his right. Between them, laid on dark velvet, was her father's jacket. It had been cleaned and treated, not stripped of its history. The leather still carried its decades, the grain and the character of a garment that had genuinely lived. But the road grime was gone, and something had been done to the leather that brought back a depth it must have had when it was new. The rip in the lining, the tear Colt Decker had made when he grabbed it in the diner, had been repaired. But not hidden. The repair had been done in gold thread laid into the damage, deliberately making the scar itself visible, making it part of the thing rather than something to be ashamed of. She stood at the table and touched it. Kintsugi, Marcus said. An old craft, the idea that what has been broken and mended carries more value for having been broken. The repair is part of the history, not a correction of it. He paused. Lorraine spent 3 hours on it last night. She learned the technique years ago from a book Garrett brought home, the kind of book that sits on a shelf until the right moment comes for it. Riley ran her finger along the gold thread. It was raised slightly from the surrounding leather, a warm line running through the dark material like something that had always been meant to be there. We need to talk about what comes next, Marcus said. He gestured to a chair and she sat, and the room arranged itself, men finding seats along the walls, Garrett and Marcus on either side of her. He placed the notebook on the table between them. This book changes things, he said. There is no version of using it that doesn't create consequences, large ones for people who are not accustomed to experiencing consequences. Your father knew that. He built this thing knowing he would not live to see what it set in motion. He left the decision to you. You told me that last night, Riley said. I'm telling you again in daylight when you've slept and eaten and you're not running on whatever you were running on in that diner. Decisions made in extremity aren't always the decisions you'd make in the morning. Riley looked at this notebook. She considered it honestly, the way Marcus clearly intended, the way her father would have wanted. She turned the choice over, looked at it from the morning side. Same answer, she said. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once with finality. All right. He stood. We ride at 10, he said to the room. Full formation. Anyone not ready by 9:30 goes in the back. The room began to move with purpose. By 9:45, the compound's main lot held more than 400 motorcycles lined in rows with the precision of people who take this kind of thing seriously. Delegations from 6 clubs stood in their formations, the patches on their backs mapping the southern corridor in leather and color. At the center, a black 1969 Cadillac hearse sat with its engine idling. In the back, through the rear glass, a pine box. Unstained simple, the kind that says what it needs to say without decoration. Beside the hearse, on the flatbed trailer that had been retrieved from the side of Interstate 40 in the dark hours before dawn, sat the shovelhead. Someone had worked on it through the night. The chrome had been polished to a depth that seemed to generate its own light, rather than merely reflect the light around it. The leather of the seat had been conditioned. The engine 3 men had spent 5 hours going through it had turned over on the first kick when Garrett tested it before sunrise and settled into the idle of a machine that has been properly cared for, steady and deep and without apology. Riley stood beside it. She was wearing her father's jacket. She was wearing it differently than she had been the night before. Not drowning in it, not hunched and trying to disappear, but straight-shouldered the jacket, finding its shape on her, the way things find their shape when they are where they are supposed to be, regardless of fit. A helmet sat on the seat beside her, matte black, no markings. Someone had found it. She didn't know how to ride yet. Garrett was going to take the shovelhead in the procession. She would ride with Marcus. But she had wanted a moment beside it first because it had been her father's, and now it was hers, and she had not yet had a moment to simply be near it without everything else pressing in. The ignition key was in her hand. Someone had found it on the diner floor during the night and left it on the nightstand in the room where she slept. Marcus appeared at her shoulder. He looked at the bike in silence, and she let him because she understood that he was seeing things she wasn't seeing. Memory and distance and the grief of a man who has outlived most of the people who mattered to him in the language of this life. He could ride anything, Marcus said. Any machine, any road, any weather. There was a night in New Mexico, February 1993, ice on the pavement, and we were running behind, and Danny just... He stopped, shook his head slightly. He rode it like the ice had agreed to behave for him, like he'd worked out some private arrangement with the laws of physics. Riley said nothing. She was storing it. She had been storing everything anyone said about her father for 8 months, building a portrait from pieces, because the man she had known had been real and loved, but had been a father with a father's necessary incompleteness. And the man he had been before that, before her, was someone she could now only know through the memories of others. He'd be furious about the jacket, Marcus said. The cleaning the gold thread. He was particular about his things. He'd say we had no business touching it. Would he mean it? Marcus thought about this genuinely. No, he'd complain about it for 20 minutes and then let it go. He was proud, but he wasn't vain about it. He always knew the difference. A pause. Time to ride. The formation moved out at 10 past 10 with the kind of controlled authority that makes civilian traffic stop and stare. 400 engines in a column that stretched further back than you could see from the front. The hearse flanked and centered, the shovelhead riding directly behind it, riderless, the machine itself a kind of statement. At the compound, Gate 3 county sheriff's cruisers sat across the exit. Sheriff Lyle Craddock stood outside the lead vehicle with his thumbs in his belt and his sunglasses on, doing his best impression of a man who still had authority over the situation. Marcus brought the column to a stop with a single hand signal that traveled back through 400 riders like a current through water. He rode forward alone. He stopped 10 feet from Craddock's bumper and killed his engine. The silence of 400 engines cutting simultaneously was a physical event, a sudden drop in pressure that the surrounding air rushed to equalize. Marcus reached into his duster and produced a folded piece of paper. Craddock took it, opened it, read it. The color left his face in stages, draining downward, and what was left was the gray-white of a man who has just seen something he was absolutely certain was buried stand up in broad daylight and look him in the eye. One page from Danny Cross's notebook. Not the original that was secured, but a reproduction clear enough to read every number, every date, Every annotation in Danny's careful hand. Craddock's name 4 times, his wife's bank account number once. 4 payment amounts with dates in a column on the right. Craddock looked up from the paper. Marcus Callahan looked back at him from the saddle surrounded by 400 riders, the November sun at his back, turning everything to silhouette in long shadow. "We're burying a man today," Marcus said. His voice was conversational and carried perfectly in the still air. "A man who spent 10 years in a federal prison keeping his mouth shut about people who deserve far worse. We're going to bury him the right way with a proper escort." A pause. "You're going to provide that escort, Sheriff. Lights and sirens, every intersection cleared, all the way to the hill." Craddock's jaw worked. "And if I don't, then that page and the 47 pages like it go to the FBI field office in Amarillo, the DEA in Lubbock, the investigative desks of 3 publications that have been looking for exactly this kind of documentation for a long time." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "There are names on those pages beyond yours. Judges. A man currently campaigning for a state legislature seat. When it falls on all of them. But it starts with you because you're the one standing in the road." Craddock looked at the paper. He looked at the column. He looked briefly at Riley on the back of Marcus's bike. The girl in the dead man's jacket watching him from behind the visor of a matte black helmet with the steady gaze of someone who has already been through the worst thing and discovered that she survived it. He crumpled the photocopy in his fist. He turned to his deputies. "Light it up. We're escorting the procession." His deputies looked at each other. One started to ask something. Craddock cut it off. "I said light it up." The blue and red came on. Craddock got in his vehicle and pulled it to the side of the road. Marcus raised his hand. The column began to move. The procession was 5 miles long, and it occupied both lanes with the authority of something that has decided correctly that the usual rules don't apply to it this morning. People on the highway pulled to the shoulder and stopped. People got out of their cars to watch because this was something that required standing in the open air to properly receive. On the overpasses, people gathered drawn by the sound and scale of it before they understood what they were seeing. Riley held Marcus's waist and felt the engine beneath them and watched the road opening ahead. The wind came over the fairing and hit her in the chest, and she let it. She thought about her father in the truck 2 nights ago in a rest stop parking lot in New Mexico when his breathing had gone wrong and then corrected itself, and he had looked at her across the cab with those eyes watchful and tired and entirely without self-pity, and said clearly, "When you get to the wolves, don't be afraid of them. They're hard men, but they understand hard things. You come from hard things. They'll see it." She had not fully believed him then. She believed him now. The cemetery was on a hill 4 miles east of the compound on a private parcel that had been paying its county taxes for 30 years without anyone asking too many questions about who owned it or why. The hill overlooked a river running high with the previous night's rain, brown and fast and purposeful. The grass was long and moved in the November wind, with a kind of presence the way wild things are present, not threatening, but alive and indifferent to whether you noticed. 400 people moved up the hill in silence. The bikes parked below along the access road, a steel shoreline. Garrett carried the pine box. 5 other men walked with him, one from each of the clubs that had come. They moved without choreography at the natural pace of men who understand what they are doing and why they are doing it. Marcus stood at the head of the open grave. I had not prepared anything. He stood in the wind with his white beard moving and his hands at his sides, and he spoke the way a man speaks when the only available option is the true thing. "Danny Cross was not an easy man," he said. "He would not want me to say otherwise, and he'd be right to resent it if I did. He had a temper and a code, and the two were not always compatible, and the people closest to him paid for that sometimes. He was not a saint, and he knew it, and he never asked anyone to pretend." He paused. The wind moved through the long grass on the hillside. What he was true. He meant what he said. He kept what he promised. In a world that offers a great many opportunities and incentives to be otherwise, he was consistently, stubbornly, sometimes infuriatingly true to his word. He took a bullet for me in 1998 and went to prison for it, And he never, not once in 25 years, made me feel the weight of what he had done. Not once. Marcus's voice remained steady. That kind of man is not common. I have been on this road for 40 years, and I have known one man like that. One. He looked at Riley. Come forward, he said. She walked to the edge of the grave. She stood beside Marcus and looked down at the pine box, simple and correctly sized, and felt the wind on her face and heard the river below. Your father left you more than a jacket and a notebook, Marcus said quietly enough that it was between the two of them in the open ground. He left you a name, and everything attached to it will follow you as long as you choose to carry it. He paused. In this world, that's not nothing. In this world, that's everything. Riley looked at the grave. She thought about her father at the table, coffee, going cold, writing in the dark. She thought about her mother, who had loved a hard man and built a life beside him, and had never in 16 years of watching seemed to regret what that cost her. She thought about Garrett on his knees on the linoleum, and Marcus's hand on the old leather, and Walt Briggs coming up from behind that counter without hesitation or announcement. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers found the Zippo Dredge Harmon's lighter, the one with the wolf, and the dagger, the thing she had carried from Flagstaff, the thing that had been the mechanism of his exposure. She turned it once in her fingers. She looked at Marcus. He nodded very slightly. She flicked the lighter. The flame came up and held in the wind steadier than it had any right to be. She dropped it into the grave. The sound from 400 people on that hill was not words. It was something older than words, a resonance, a collective low sound that moved through the hill and out over the river and into the November sky. Garrett stepped forward. He held out a vest. Small, new, constructed of the same heavy leather as everything else in this world, but without the patina of road and time. The leather was dark and clean and waiting. On the front, over the left breast, 2 lines on a rectangular patch. Property of no one. Prospect. You want in, Marcus said. Not quite a question. You understand what that means. There are no exceptions made for lineage or for last night. You start at the bottom. You clean bikes. You learn the code. It takes as long as it takes. Riley looked at the vest. She looked at the road stretching away down the hill, gray and wet and going somewhere. She looked at the grave. She took the vest. She put it on over her father's jacket. The two together were heavy. She didn't mind the weight. Good, Marcus said. He turned to the hillside. We're done here. Give him the road. The engine started below, one and then another, and then all at once the sound building from the hillside and going out across the plains in waves. 400 machines saying the thing that the words had already said, but in a language older than language. Riley stayed until the last of the dirt had fallen. Garrett stayed with her. When it was done, she placed her hand flat on the ground for a moment, the gesture her father had used when acknowledging something he didn't want to make a speech about, and then she stood up and walked down the hill. The shovel head was at the bottom. The year that followed was not simple or clean. Nothing in this world was, and Riley had understood that going in, or understood it, as well as a 16-year-old can understand the shape of a life she is choosing to enter. She cleaned bikes and learned the hierarchy and paid attention to everything. She made mistakes and corrected them without being told twice. She rode pillion on long runs and stored everything she observed. Lorraine taught her things in the evenings, how to do mechanical repairs, how to read a paper map properly, how to cook for 30 people when you have what you have. These were not the lessons Riley had expected from this place, but she approached them with the same attention she brought to everything else, because her father had once told her that the people who last anywhere are the ones who take every education seriously, even the ones that don't look like education from the outside. Garrett brought her a legal text one afternoon, federal evidence statutes, dense and specific. He set it on the table without comment. She read it in 4 days and asked him 3 questions. He answered them precisely. The conversation ended there, but something else had begun. Marcus met with her monthly, not in the chapel, but in the small office behind the bar where he kept his actual records. He talked about the notebook and the strategy around it. Which names could be moved against first, which needed to be held, which might become useful rather than targeted. Riley listened. She asked questions when she had them. Her observations when she offered them were more often correct than not, because she had inherited her father's instinct for how information connects before the picture is complete. The notebook did not go to the FBI directly. Not yet. Marcus was not a man who moved before he had secured the ground beneath his feet. What the notebook did was change the atmosphere, the specific pressurized atmosphere of arrangements between certain law enforcement and certain cartel logistics operations in the corridor. A wire transfer disrupted, a reassignment that happened quietly, a case moving at a different pace than it had been. The notebook was not a weapon that had been fired. It was a weapon whose existence was known. That knowledge, distributed with precision to the right people, was doing its work steadily and without announcement. The year passed. On a Tuesday evening in November, 12 months after the night at Walt's Roadside Grill, Riley Cross came back. She parked the shovelhead in the lot. She had her license, now had earned it properly, had spent 6 months learning the machine before she trusted herself with public roads. She went inside. The bell above the door made its small sound. Walt Briggs looked up from behind the counter. He had replaced the kitchen door. He had not replaced the dish rag. He looked at Riley at the vest at the member patch that had replaced the prospect patch 3 weeks ago after a club vote that was not close, and gave her a nod that contained more warmth than most people manage with complete sentences. Donna Fike was behind the counter wearing a small silver pin on her apron, a wolf's head simply rendered. She smiled when she saw Riley. An uncomplicated smile, the kind that means exactly what it looks like. Riley took the corner booth, the same one, back to the wall, sight lines to the door in the kitchen. She was 17 now. She did not look like the girl who had come through that door a year ago, not because the surface had changed. The blonde hair and the slight build and the blue eyes were all the same, but because the things she carried now were carried differently. Not heavier, just differently. The way a pack feels different when you have learned how to distribute the weight across your frame. She was reading a legal brief Marcus had given her that morning when the door opened. 3 men. She knew they weren't truckers or locals the moment they crossed the threshold because they came in with the posture of men who are accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around their arrival. And rooms like Walt's don't rearrange themselves around anyone. Good suits, polished shoes, precise haircuts, hands that had never done physical labor. Cartel lawyers. The species was identifiable after enough study. Their eyes found her immediately. The leader slid into the seat across from her without asking. He was perhaps 50, face trained out of expressiveness, a professional instrument. Prescott Vane. He had a reputation for making problems disappear into legal machinery, and he had the controlled manner of a man who was confident in his leverage before a conversation even began. The other two positioned themselves at either end of the table, blocking egress, old habit. "Ms. Cross," Vane said, "you're not difficult to find." "I wasn't trying to be," Riley said. She finished the sentence she was reading before she looked up. Vane placed a briefcase on the table. He opened it with practiced motion. Inside banded stacks of $100 bills, arranged with the precision of someone who understands that presentation is part of the offer. $2 million, Vane said, for the notebook. Full contents, all copies, all reproductions. Confirmation within 48 hours. He folded his hands. "You're 17. This is more money than most people see in a lifetime. You take this, you walk away from all of it. You go to school, you live something resembling a normal life." Riley looked at the money. She looked at it honestly with the seriousness the offer deserved because her father had taught her to take the real measure of things. $2 million was not nothing. She was 17 and she had chosen a hard road and she was living what that meant every day, and taking that seriously was not weakness. She took the real measure. Then she looked at Vane. "Sheriff Craddock had an accident last month," she said. Vane's expression didn't change. "I heard. Terrible thing. His brakes failed outside Cloudcroft. He walked away barely." She paused. "He was no longer useful to your clients, so they removed the exposure. That's the pattern. I wouldn't know anything about that. You would actually, but we'll set that aside." Riley closed the briefcase. She did not push it back toward him. She simply closed it. The notebook is not for sale. My father did not build it as a commodity. Your father, Vane said carefully, is dead. Yes. She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who has already been through the worst and found that she could carry it. And the people responsible for that are going to spend the rest of their lives discovering what he built and what it's capable of. She folded her hands on the table, mirroring his posture precisely. He spent 10 years in federal prison protecting someone he cared about. He spent the last 8 months of his life dying building something to protect his daughter after he was gone. He did not do that so his daughter could sell it and go to college. Vane leaned slightly forward, and the professional courtesy left his voice. Ms. Cross, the people I represent do not accept no as a permanent position. They have considerable resources and considerable patience. I know what resources they have, Riley said evenly. I've been reading about them for a year. She glanced at the brief beside her. And I know what resources we have, which is why I'm not particularly concerned about this conversation. She reached under the table. Both bodyguards moved. Hands went toward jackets. Riley's hand came out holding a phone. She pressed one button and set it on the table. Outside, the sound built the way a storm builds from nothing. A low resonance that arrived in the chest before it became identifiable, and then it became identifiable, and then it became immense. Engines, many of them running in the organized thunder of a column that knows exactly where it is going and why. Through the windows of Walt's roadside grill, headlights appeared. Not 5 or 10, more than the parking lot could properly contain. They filled the lot and the road and the field beside the road, and in the light of them, the falling rain became a wall of silver. Marcus Callahan stood visible through the front window beside his machine, holding a short weapon with the easy familiarity of a man holding something he is entirely comfortable with. Behind him, in rows that extended to the limit of visibility in the rain, the Iron Wolves and their allies waited. Vane looked at the window. He looked at his bodyguards who had gone entirely still. He looked back at Riley. You called them while you were reading, he said. I called them when you pulled into the lot, Riley said. Walt has a camera. We've been expecting a visit for several months. She leaned forward slightly, and in the lean there was something that had not been in the 16-year-old girl who came through that door 12 months ago. Not menace, but absolute certainty. The certainty of a person who has taken the full measure of her situation and found that she is not afraid of the measurement. Take your money. Go back to your clients. Tell them the terms have changed. The notebook doesn't go away when they pay because there is no price at which it goes away. The notebook stays where it is and continues doing what it's doing. And if anyone connected to your clients touches anyone connected to this family, she looked briefly at Walt behind the counter, at Donna near the register, at the window full of light and engines. We don't send emails. We come ourselves, all of us, and we don't stop. Vane stared at her. He had been doing this work for 15 years and had sat across from federal prosecutors and cartel principals and men who were capable of genuine and immediate violence, and he was doing the thing people do when they are trying to reconcile the sum total of their experience with what is currently in front of them. He closed the briefcase. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at her for one more moment. This isn't over, he said. It is for tonight, Riley said. Drive carefully. Vane moved to the door. His bodyguards formed up around him. The door opened, and the sound of 400 engines and the smell of rain and exhaust came briefly through the room, and then the door swung shut. Through the window, Riley watched them move through the lot, watched the assembled riders part to let them through in silence. Not because the riders were yielding, but because they were choosing to let them leave rather than doing something else. And that choice was more frightening than any physical obstruction would have been. She watched the black car find the road and go. Then Marcus came through the door, rain dark on the shoulders, holding the short weapon loosely at his side, wearing the particular grin of a man who has been in confrontations for 40 years and has discovered somewhere in his 7th decade that they remain interesting. Did they take the deal, he said. They didn't like the terms, Riley said. Marcus laughed, the full laugh of a man who means it completely. He crossed the room and put one hand on her shoulder. Brief, firm, the gesture that said what it needed to say without requiring anything more from words. He looked at the vest, at the member patch. He looked at it with an expression that was about her and about her father, and about 35 years of road that had gone through more darkness than anyone had anticipated and was still going. Riley picked up her helmet. She stood up. She tucked the legal brief under her arm. She walked to the door and pushed it open into the rain, and the sound and the light in the assembled column shifted to make space for her as she came through. Not the way a crowd parts for a dignitary, but the way water moves for something that belongs in it, the natural accommodation of a thing that has found its element at last. The shovel head was where she had left it. She swung her leg over the saddle and settled into the seat and felt the machine under her, the specific weight and balance of something that has been ridden hard for 40 years by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. She put the key in the ignition. She kicked the starter. The engine turned over on the first kick. It always did. The sound it made settling into its idle was the sound of something continuing. Not unchanged, not the same as it had been, but continuous. The same engine, the same machine, different hands on the bars. Now the road ahead, the same road. It had always been going wherever it went, asking only that you point yourself at it and commit. Marcus pulled alongside her on his machine. He looked at her, then at the highway stretching out ahead, silver with rain and going somewhere. Ready, he said. She put on her helmet. She pulled out of the lot onto the highway, and the column fell in around her and behind her. 400 engines saying the one thing this world says above all others, that the road continues and the people on it continue, and the things that tried to stop them did not succeed. The rain was still falling, the same rain it had always been, patient and indifferent and permanent, the rain that had been falling on this part of Texas long before any of them existed, and would be falling long after all of them were gone. Riley Cross rode into it and did not look back. The road took her the way roads take people who belong on them completely and without ceremony and without looking back either.